And I think maybe now we should turn it over to questions.
Two questions. Will we be able to get a copy of your PowerPoint?
Sure.
And the next question is, what is the city doing to reduce its own use of energy and gas emissions?
Sure.
For instance, the Department of Environmental Protection spends an enormous amount of energy moving water around
Absolutely.
the city, as opposed to buses and subways.
Mm-hmm. So, like I mentioned in the benchmarking bill, the city's doing benchmarking a year ahead. In terms of plaNYC overall, the city likes to lead by example. So the city's goal is a 30% reduction by 2030. But for city-owned municipal buildings, we aim for a 30% reduction by 2017. And we've allocated 10% of the city's energy budget to reach that goal. So over the past few years, I believe it was last June, the city released a report, an action plan of what we're going to do to the year 2017 in order to achieve that 30% reduction. And we're basically doing in city buildings what we've required for the private sector, but to a much higher level. We're doing energy audits. We're installing all the retrofits. Most of the retrofits pay back in 10 years, so we're going way ahead of the curve because we're long-time building owners. We can afford to wait for the paybacks. We're doing retrocommissioning. We're working on our school buses, and the whole gamut. So the report covers everything from the buildings to the Department of Environmental Protection. So I think there's been about 200 projects so far since 2007, specifically addressing cities' buildings to reduce our energy consumption. And if you wait till April, that's when we're going to release our annual report, and we'll have solid numbers saying how much the city actually has achieved in reaching our 30% goal by 2017. And actually, on that same vein, we put out a challenge to the universities to match the city's goal of a 30% reduction by 2017. And NYU is a participant in the mayoral challenge and one of our best participants. It looks like you guys are going to be achieving a 40% reduction. You're way ahead of the curve. You have great plans. So if you haven't, check out your school's own plan. It's really impressive.
Sorry, I'm a little late, but is there a plan by the city to actually install solar panels on buildings in the future?
That's another project that we have going on. We received a grant. We're one of the Solar America cities, and it's a partnership that we have with CUNY. And there's a couple different efforts in terms of solar panels. One, the city put out an RFP for people to own and operate solar panels on city buildings. So we would just be the host to the solar panels, and that's in the works. And then the Solar America Cities project with CUNY, they're doing, I actually heard a little bit of buzz in the office about it yesterday. They're doing a big project in terms of mapping the roof space and looking at different spaces in the 5 boroughs in terms of where we can actually put solar panels. So there's a lot more going on. A lot of our solar activity is housed in the Office of Economic Development. So EDC does a lot of our solar work.
So essentially these private investors would be selling back energy to the city?
They would be, I'm not sure exactly how that works. So I'd have to get you more information on that, sorry.
Could you speak to any programs that address the 98% of buildings that are under 50,000 square feet?
Sure. So the Green Codes Task Force, that's one of them. The codes apply to all buildings. And there's actually a couple proposals of those 111 that specifically target small homes. So there's one of those 111 proposals recommends that they require that anytime there's a sale of the home, it has to be upgraded similar to the rules in Berkeley, California. And there's a long list of things that have to be done prior to the transaction of a home, upgrading the water supplying, like the faucets and toilets, and putting insulation and making sure it's more efficient at the time of sale. There's another proposal for HERS rating, similar to the benchmarking rating that's used for homes, where benchmarking isn't really applicable to homes. This one is. So as the Green Code Task Force moves through, that was really the big effort to target the smaller buildings. But first out the gate is the large buildings, because they're the ones that are more capable given their staff. So the next step is to work on the smaller buildings. And actually, if you would look at a curve of New York City's square footage, you'll see there's a big part of buildings over 1 million square feet, and then there's a big dip in the middle, and then again it rises for the small homes. So really targeting those two ends is what we're looking to do.
So if individual co-op owners want to go sell their apartment in, I don't know, 2015 or something, they're going to be required to upgrade the plumbing?
Potentially, that's one of the proposals. The Green Code Task Force is just a set of proposals. Unlike the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, those 4 bills were actually passed into law. These are 111 ideas, sort of drafts. Now the city is working. We actually, tomorrow is going to be the first of a series of weekly meetings to go through all of them one by one and see which ones are feasible for the city. A lot of them were it was all volunteers, so 200 volunteers could only do so much on their free time. So now we need to bring those proposals to the next step to see what would be feasible. It took 2 years to develop those bills, so we anticipated it would take a little while to get those up to snuff.
Two questions. Sounds like the green code upgrade of the New York code kind of makes LEED obsolete. And is there a consideration on
Well, it doesn't make LEED obsolete. LEED is a standard, whereas a code is the bare minimum in terms of construction. So when you build to LEED, you're going above the standard. So your energy performance has to be 14% above code. So we're looking just at what the code level would be.
So the upgrade, the green upgrade doesn't surpass the LEED?
In some cases, it mimics LEED because the task force felt that they were easily achievable, the materials were widespread in the market, it was cost effective, and it made sense. For example, one of the proposals is for low VOC paint, which is a LEED requirement. But they felt that that paint is widely available, it's competitive at market prices, so making that the code standard shouldn't be a problem. And if you actually dig into the report, at the end of each proposal, it tells you how it relates to LEED. If this becomes code, all buildings would achieve this LEED point. This is similar to the LEED point, it would get you halfway there, and things like that. So it tries to help you compare the two. Also to note, there was a very specific reason why the city chose to take this route and ask Urban Green to convene this task force. Other cities just mandated LEED as code, and we see that that's not the most effective way to bring up the rear. The building professionals in New York are familiar with our codes. It's something they already do, they already have to follow, and LEED, again, is a standard, it's not a code. And that's why the ICC and ASHRAE have developed these codes, because people were turning to LEED as a code and they felt that that wasn't a suitable response.
Second question was, is there any input, consideration of green roofs beyond what is currently, as far as incentives and such?
The Green Code Task Force had no proposals in terms of mandating a green roof. However, it's one of the few tax abatements that the city does have. So, yep, I know there's a lot of difficulty, but there is a tax abatement for green roofs and a tax abatement for solar. And it's one of the things the city is slowly working on. But
And green meaning vegetative as opposed to white?
There's also a big initiative for cool roofs in terms of coating roofs with a white coating to make them reduce the urban heat island effect. So that's a whole other effort. And there was launched with the Mayor and Al Gore, actually, when he was here. They were up on the roofs in Long Island City painting them. And the Department of Buildings is working to really spread the amount of cool roofs in the city.
Just on that note, though, I think I read that there is a reference to LEED EB for the auditing portion, and also Energy Star. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So as part of the audit and retrocommissioning bills, there's some exceptions. If you have already, let me try to remember this. If you're an Energy Star building and received an Energy Star score of 75 or above and went through the EPA's quality review process, then you would be exempt from doing the energy audit if you achieve that rating within 2 years of your due date. So you could be an Energy Star building today, but if you come due in 7 years and you haven't achieved that score again, you'd have to do the audit. Again, for the retrocommissioning, if you achieved the LEED EB points, there's 2 points for retrocommissioning. If you achieve those 2 points, then you will not need to perform the retrocommissioning. The concept is that we don't need to penalize buildings if they're already performing well, then that's great. We want people to be ahead of the curve and already doing the right thing. So there are exceptions built into the bills if you're already performing well.
And maybe two related questions. The first is, in terms of benchmarking and getting a sense of where the city's current performance is, do you guys have a good sense of what percentage of these buildings, whether over 50,000 or under 50,000 square feet, and how efficiently they perform on average? And then the second is, what are the biggest challenges that you see to implementing these codes? Where are the sticking points between the idea and actual implementation?
Sure. So benchmark, that's a good question in terms of how well our buildings are performing. We're getting an idea with the city buildings because we're benchmarking all of them and conducting an audit, and some of the results are actually surprising because we didn't know. Some schools are performing fabulously and some schools are really underperforming. So we don't know for the private sector. Energy information has always been private, and it's not widely shared. So benchmarking is going to really lead us in that direction. There are a lot of private companies that think they have the data, and they've shared it with us, but there isn't a comprehensive data set out there. And the Environmental Protection Agency is actually ecstatic that the city is requiring this. And other cities across, within a week after we required it, benchmarking, Seattle put their law into effect. So we're slowly going to start being able to collect this data nationwide, and that's when we're really going to have a good pool to really work with in terms of making our buildings more efficient. In terms of sticking points, I'm sure there's loads. Where to start? Benchmarking, I've heard there's a lot of problems getting Con Ed to give you full building data. A lot of companies have been working with them, and it's a little bit of a struggle. So to get whole building data, there's no requirement for residential buildings to ask the tenants for data. That was something that we did because we've heard of the issues with Con Ed. And as we worked through the bills, there was a lot of issues that came up, and the bills, that's why it took 2 years. They were rewritten to try to avoid a lot of these sticking points. But the Department of Buildings still has to go through a rulemaking process. Even though the bills were passed, the rules still need to be written, which are all the details of implementation of these bills, and that's a public process. Anybody sitting in this room can apply to be a part of the rulemaking process. I encourage you to do that. Hopefully within the next few weeks, the Department of Buildings will have the application to be a part of the rulemaking team. They're calling it the Greener, Greater Buildings Advisory Panel to help really flesh out the rules of these bills. And that's where we're going to try and address all those sticking points.
Is the Green Codes task force, the 111 pieces, how do those get adopted? Is that just by
One has already been passed into law. Speaker Quinn, right after the release, one of the proposals was to form an interagency green team that would really help people in the construction field move green projects along that we're having issues with. So this was a bill that was put together. It's now going to be hosted by our office to bring the different agencies together when there's an issue. For example, people were having a problem with building mounted wind, bringing the different agencies together that would have to implement and enforce that, and trying to work through those issues faster, specifically related to sustainability. And that was one of the 111. So that was passed by a law. Some of them require rule changes, so it would just be, if it applies to DEP, it would be a rule change through their legal process. There's the consensus process. There are 111. Some of them aren't even proposals. They're recommendations for a study. So we're looking for people who are going to be interested in picking up those studies and working at the details, because the ideas weren't ready enough to be actual code changes. So they all have a different trajectory, and we'll have to see how that plays out over the next year.
For the buildings that are under 50,000 square feet, so let's say your average 6, 8, 10-unit building in the boroughs, and someone wanted to buy a building based on the fact that they can make those retrofits with or without funding from the city, loans from the city, and they were going to make those necessary changes. Is there been any study as to what kind of, based on this general benchmark, which we don't really know what it is, but let's say we kind of just throw a number out, is there an idea of what the return on investment would be to that investor making all those improvements that you're speaking of?
It's very building specific. It depends how bad the building was performing. That's what the energy audit really is for. The energy auditor is supposed to do an analysis and tell you how quick the payback would be and how worthwhile the investment would be. So I would be hard-pressed to give you an answer specifically on that. It really would depend on the building.
I'm thinking of two other portions of the code that are required, the fire code and accessibility. The way they kind of keep those in play is they constantly, over time, come back and make sure that your building is still performing up to standard, up to code. Is there anything in place to make sure that year after year after year that these buildings will maintain?
Yeah, you guys could have been on the Green Codes Task Force. You have a lot of the same ideas of some of the proposals. There are a significant amount of proposals relating specifically to that, because operations and maintenance is one of the key components. There's a requirement to train building operators to make sure they are making sure the building stays up to snuff every year after year. There's a proposal in terms of boiler inspections to make sure that there's boiler inspections every year in terms of safety, but the ones in terms of energy efficiency and air pollution, that doesn't happen every year. That's to make that inspection required once a year. So there are proposals tucked into those 111 that really tackle exactly what you're saying.
If someone does some improvements under the PACE system and they pay back through increased property taxes, what period of time does that increase property taxes run?
I really am not familiar with that. I'm not sure. I think that's one of the things that they have to work out the details. But what I do know is that the loan stays with the building. So if an owner is going to sell the building, the payback of that loan stays with the property taxes. So that's one of the major benefits of using this, that it doesn't discourage a building owner from making that improvement because they won't see the savings. The payback will stay with the building.
It doesn't jeopardize the current financing. It doesn't affect existing loans in any way.
That's why, yeah.
The definition of municipal buildings, if you lease space, is that
If you look at the bills, each bill has a specific definition for facility buildings. And I actually forgot to mention in the audits and retrocommissioning bill, city buildings are required to actually implement the retrofits that pay back for them in 7 years. So in that case, the definition for city buildings includes buildings that we own and then buildings where we lease space and pay the energy bills. So if we're leasing space and paying the energy bills, then we're going to be required to do the energy audit in that space.
So you'd pay for the upgrades versus the landlord?
If we're leasing space. And there's a lot of city buildings where we lease the entire building. We're not the owner.
A couple things. On the audits, are they ASHRAE level?
They're at
2?
ASHRAE level 2 audits,
Level
yes.
2 audit.
That's what's in the bill now, but that's subject to change through the rulemaking process. But if a building owner wanted to do an audit today, that's what they should follow.
Okay. And then secondly, retrocommissioning, the Department of Energy has cost figures from anywhere from 5 to 40 cents per square foot to just to do the retrocommission site survey. Is there any plans for the mayor's office to have its own internal retrocommissioning body to assist?
To perform the
perform
retrocommissioning?
retro?
Well, that's what the qualifications were in the bill. So to perform retrocommissioning, you'd have to have one of 5 different certifications. One's a CCP, a Certified Commissioning Professional from the BCA. So you'd have to have a team. So one person would have to have that certification, a person with years of experience performing retrocommissioning, and then a registered architect or a registered architect or a professional engineer to sign off on it. So it's that team that would make the retrocommissioning possible. So it's having the different criteria.
Is there any plans for the mayor's office of the city to have a department or a sub-department that has those components all together that me as Joe building owner can say, you know what,
The private sector. And I already know one specific company that has partnered in engineering, architects, and designers have already partnered to perform these services. So they're already sprouting up. So they're ahead of the game.
Well, as I understand, money funding, the bottom loan is for the retrofit. Is there any money or funding available for the actual audit or commissioning afterwards?
That's where I point to NYSERDA. NYSERDA does a lot of cost sharing for audits. Through all their programs, their FlexTech program will fund half the audit. I'm trying to think. Then they also have their residential program that would fund part of the audit. I don't know all the details about their funding streams, but I know that they do provide a lot of incentive to do the energy audits. Any other questions?
I'm just curious, for the benchmarking, are you do you somehow factor in a building's vacant space to make sure the figures are accurate?
The tool does that. So you have to put in the different square footage. They'll ask you how much square footage makes up a garage, makes up, data center space, and you'll put in those spaces and you add. There is a category for vacant space.
So including like just vacant office space?
Exactly. And the tool isn't perfect by any means. It's something that we are working with the EPA on addressing in terms of, for example, data centers, TV studios are really energy intensive, and a lot of people felt that the tool didn't accurately measure them. So right now, displaying that information is going to be suppressed for the first few years until we feel the tool really accurately represents that. So over the next few years, there's a lot of subgroups that are forming in terms of working with the EPA to refine the tool to make sure it's representing the space the best way it can.
For the city to meet its targets, does shedding space included?
Yep, there's actually an initiative. I believe its acronym is called SPACE. That was started in the Mayor's Office of Operations. It's doing a full analysis of the different space that we're using, renting, leasing, and really trying to consolidate that. I believe if the University Challenge or NYU participated, there was a presentation on that last time, and Cooper Union gave a good example of how they've actually, by getting rid of one of their buildings and decreasing the amount of space they've used, they've saved energy. So it's a good model. Ken?
In terms of benchmarking, I think both energy and water, if I understood right, is by usage per square foot. That's that benchmark. Do you count for building use? Like, some restaurants and buildings might be open 24 hours a day.
You put those factors in. So you put in hours of use and building type. So you would identify if it's an office space or things like that to what the building is used for. So
Nothing more like, some businesses run 24 hours.
yeah, you put in hours of use and operation. So you could write 24 hours a day if it is. So.
Will the city make the data available earlier for people working on projects or trying to engage, I don't know, building systems, sort of like the way that Google will release software to outside developers to start working with it?
I don't believe so. The city buildings data will be released as soon as possible, and that'll be made public. And that's about 4,000 buildings, so it'll be a good data set to work with.
But for the private buildings, it'll all go up simultaneously. And you said that's like 2 years?
So next May 1st of 2011 will be the first benchmarking for private sector buildings, and then the following September is when they're going to be disclosed. And then every year after, buildings will have to benchmark in May, and the public output will be in September.
If you have a historic building that maybe with a landmarked interior, would that conflict with the energy code in any way?
So there's a lot of exemptions in the energy code for landmarked interiors and certain landmark facades in terms of complying with the energy code. So if it's exempt from the energy code, it wouldn't have to abide by any of the other regulations. So.
Anything else?
Well, thank you for coming this morning and listening. Good.